The spice trade. In the summer of 1498, the smell reached the ships before the city appeared. Off the coast of Calicut, Portuguese sailors stood against the rails and breathed air heavy with pepper, cinnamon, and smoke. Men had died crossing the ocean. Others had gone mad from hunger and fear. Yet ahead of them waited the richest trade network on earth. On the deck stood Vasco da Gama. His clothes were stiff with salt. His gums bled from disease. But he knew something the people of Calicut did not. Europe had not come only to trade. It had come to control the road to pepper, whatever the cost. Most people remembered the spice trade as a story about luxury and exotic food. But that version missed the truth. Pepper redirected empires. It launched dangerous voyages across unknown seas. It financed wars, destroyed cities, and connected continents that had barely known one another before. And one famous myth was wrong. Europeans did not use spices mainly to hide rotten meat. Historians found little evidence for that idea. Pepper became valuable because people truly loved its taste, rarity, and status. There was another forgotten reality. For centuries, Europe controlled almost none of the spice trade. The wealth flowed through Arab, Indian, African, and Southeast Asian merchants long before European ships arrived. So how did a tiny black berry become one of the most desired objects on Earth? And how did pepper help reshape the world itself? Long before European kings dreamed of ocean empires, the spice trade already stretched across half the world. The Arab sailors crossed the Indian Ocean using monsoon winds with astonishing skill. Indian merchants carried black pepper from the forests of Kerala. Chinese fleets moved silk and porcelain through crowded ports. In the markets of Cairo, Calicut, and Malacca, traders spoke dozens of languages beneath roofs darkened by smoke and heat. Europe stood at the far western edge of this system. It was not the center. Ordinary life in medieval Europe felt harsh beside this wealthy commercial world. Winters brought hunger. Roads became rivers of mud after rain. Most people never traveled farther than a few miles from home. Pepper changed everything because it came from somewhere unimaginably distant. A single sack of pepper might pass through 20 pairs of hands before reaching Venice. By the time it arrived in Europe, it sometimes became valuable enough to pay taxes or rent property. In parts of Germany, rich merchants were even nicknamed pepper sacks. Yet the deeper irony was this. The men who later claimed they had discovered the spice routes entered systems that already worked perfectly well without them. Then came the turning point. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople. European kingdoms feared losing access to eastern trade routes. Portugal moved first. Small and poor, Portugal possessed few advantages except ambition. Prince Henry the Navigator funded voyages farther down the coast of Africa year after year. Ships vanished into storms. Sailors disappeared. Still, the expeditions continued. In 1488, Bartolomeu Diaz reached the southern tip of Africa after terrifying storms pushed his fleet into unknown waters. His exhausted crew begged him to turn back. But Diaz realized he had found something extraordinary. A sea route connecting Europe to the Indian Ocean. For the first time, the spice markets of Asia no longer seemed unreachable. Still, a route meant nothing without control. When Vasco da Gama arrived in India, local merchants laughed at the cheap gifts he offered. Da Gama returned home, humiliated but determined. On later voyages, Portuguese fleets bombarded coastal cities, seized merchant ships, and demanded tribute across the Indian Ocean. One witness described Portuguese forces burning ships with passengers trapped inside. Pepper had begun to reshape morality itself. And yet the gamble worked. Lisbon exploded with wealth. Ships returned carrying spices worth fortunes. Suddenly, Portugal financed enormous fleets and fortresses across Africa and Asia. Then the Dutch entered the trade. The Dutch East India Company became something new in history, a corporation powerful enough to wage war and conquer territory for profit. Its leaders understood a brutal truth. Control of spices required limiting supply. On the Banda Islands, where nutmeg grew naturally, Dutch forces massacred or expelled much of the local population after resistance against Dutch rule. All this destruction for flavor. Still, the obsession deepened. English and French merchants joined the struggle. On oceans filled with armed ships hunting spices small enough to fit inside a hand. At its height, the spice trade transformed global geography. Ports expanded into major cities. Navigation improved rapidly. European kingdoms gained wealth that later fueled larger empires. But success carried its own shadow. By the 18th century, pepper and other spices became more common in Europe. Prices slowly fell. What had once symbolized impossible luxury entered ordinary kitchens. Meanwhile, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Across Asia and Africa, local rulers lost power as European trading empires tightened military control. Traditional trade systems fractured. Violence followed profit across the oceans. Then quietly, the age of spice monopolies began to collapse, and French smugglers succeeded in transplanting spice plants beyond Dutch-controlled islands. Soon, spices grew across multiple colonies. The object that had driven centuries of exploration could no longer remain rare. In the end, the spice trade closed not with a final battle, but with abundance. Pepper became ordinary, yet the old roots never truly disappeared. In Kerala, pepper still grew in the same humid forests where merchants harvested it centuries earlier. Across former trading ports, languages, architecture, and cuisine still carried traces of those ancient exchanges. And Vasco da Gama's arrival at Calicut revealed its deeper meaning only with time. He had not opened an empty road. He had entered an ancient global system and turned it into a battlefield. Without the spice trade, the modern world might have emerged far more slowly, and a European exploration may never have accelerated with such urgency. Cities like Lisbon, Amsterdam, and London would have followed very different paths. History also judged the spice trade too simply. Older stories portrayed Europeans as heroic explorers discovering unknown worlds. That version ignored the sophistication of Asian and Islamic trade networks already operating at immense scale. But the trade was not only greed and conquest. It was also curiosity, endurance, courage, and human imagination on a global scale. A tiny black berry helped connect the world for the first time in history. Very few objects had ever changed civilization so completely. So here was the final question. Did the spice trade ultimately benefit humanity by connecting civilizations? Or did the violence it unleashed outweigh the exchange of knowledge and culture? Pepper began as a seasoning. It ended as one of the engines of world history,